Hello and welcome back to IAmMe, where today we're going to be looking at fractions. We're going to discover what is a fraction and why do we actually use them. To start, I want you to imagine that you're at a birthday party. You're singing happy birthday to the lucky birthday boy or girl, but I know what's going on in your brain. You're thinking, is it vanilla? Is it sponge? Is it chocolate? You're just thinking about the cake. And that's what I want you to think about. Just the cake. Because I know you're about to get a piece of that cake at that party, aren't you? And actually, that piece could also be called a fraction. Why? The reason why is because you're getting a piece of the whole cake. You're not just going to go up and take the entire cake, even though you want to. You're only going to get a part of it. It'll be a big part, hopefully, but you're going to get a part, which also could be called a fraction. So in simplest forms, a fraction just means a part of a whole, and in this case, a piece of the cake. Let's take a look. Like I said, fractions represent a part of a whole. But why do we need them? In life, we often use fractions when looking at the time, going shopping, baking, in sports, and in food. It is important that we have a way to show when we want something or need something that isn't a whole. When we go shopping, you might see half-price clothing. In baking, you may say you need a quarter of a cup. And in pizzas are always split into eighths. So how do we know what the fraction means? And how do we make these fractions so we can say them to other people? Well, fractions are always split into two parts. Your teacher will tell you they are the numerator and denominator. But I want you to forget that for a moment. I want you to focus on the parts and the whole. The parts is the number that goes on top. The whole is the number that goes on the bottom. And we draw a fraction like this. Parts at the top, a line across, a hole on the bottom. So what do fractions actually mean? Well, at the top it tells you how many parts that you have. The bottom tells you how many parts would make up the whole. So thinking back at the party, how many parts would the cake be split into? If there's 30 children at the party, it'd be split into 30 parts. How many parts will you get? 1. So we would write this fraction, 1 part at the top, 30 on the bottom, because the whole is split into 30 parts. Let's take a look at a few examples that you might come across in real life. Let's start with time, because time is quite difficult anyway. Time, we often say half an hour or a quarter of an hour. Well, half an hour is when you take an hour, which is 60 minutes, and split it into 2 parts. Here's the most important thing about fractions though. The parts have to be equally split. Both parts have to be equal if you're splitting it into 2. So, I can't just take 5 minutes and 55 minutes because that wouldn't be equal. I have to split it equally in 2. Let's see. So now I have my clock and I've split it into 2 equal parts. You can easily see that each part is worth 30 minutes. Hence why 30 minutes is said to be half an hour. Do you remember how I write fractions? The parts that I have go on the top and the parts that I split my whole into go on the bottom. So if I said I have half an hour, I have the part, just 1, and my whole, which was split into 2. What about a quarter of an hour? Well, a quarter is split into 4 parts. Do you remember what I have to do? What's the most important thing about fractions? You've got it. I've got to split them into 4 equal parts. Now that I've done that, I can see how many minutes are in one of those quarters. You see? 15 minutes. I'm going to get rid of the other 3. Don't need them. Bye-bye. Now I have 1/4 of an hour. How can I write that? Well, I've got 1 part that goes on the top, remembering how many parts that you have always goes on the top. And do you remember how many parts my whole was split into? How many parts of the clock that I split this into? Hopefully you remember it's 4. So the 4 goes on the bottom because that's what the whole was split into. Let's see if we can use what we have learnt. Here we have 4 different questions with shapes with parts of them shaded in. And we know a fraction is a part of a whole. So these shaded parts represent a part of a whole, and as a result can be used and wrote as fractions. Let's start off with the yellow one. How many parts make up our whole? Well, let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I know 6 parts make up my whole. Where does the 6 go? Does it go on the top or the bottom? Yes, you're right. It goes on the bottom because it represents my whole. How many parts do I have shaded? Just 1. And that goes on top, making sure I remember to put a line between them both. Now let's move to the left and look at the red long rectangle. How many parts makes up my whole? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 parts make up my whole, remembering they're all equal size parts. So the 7, where does it go? Shout it to me. It goes on the bottom. And how many parts do I have shaded? 1, 2, 3. And where does that go? On top. Well done. That gives me a fraction of 3/7. Let's move down to the blue. How many parts are shaded? Let's do it the opposite way this time. How many parts are shaded? 1. Where does that digit go? Does it go on the top or the bottom? Well, it's the parts that I have shaded, so that goes on the top. Remembering what goes on the bottom is the parts that make up the whole. So how many parts make up the whole? 1, 2, 3. This fraction is 1/3. And finally, we have another shape. Let's start with how many we have again. We have 1, 2. We have 2 parts. Remembering how many parts that you have go on the top, and remembering how many parts the whole is made up of goes on the bottom, and the parts that the whole is made up of is 1, 2, 3, 2/3. I think you're ready to have a go by yourself. All you need to remember is the parts that you have, or the parts that are shaded, go on top, and the parts that make up the whole, or how many pieces the whole has been split into, goes on the bottom. If you want extra support, you can find worksheets and resources in the links below. Have a nice day.